I just want to make sure that we are formally opening the circle here. So I am thrilled, absolutely thrilled to introduce Michelle Holliday, consultant, facilitator, researcher, and author of the book, The Age of Thrivability, Vital Perspectives and Practices for a Better World. Welcome to our Lake Erie Institute Communities Ecological Consciousness Exchange Program, which is sponsored generously by Cuyahoga Arts and Culture. Michelle's work centers on a philosophical view that we can create the conditions for life to thrive at every level, for individuals, for organizations, for communities, and for the biosphere itself. Michelle helps bring people together to help us discover ways we can feel more alive, connect more meaningfully with one another, and serve life through our gathering and through collective action. And that's why we're here today in this virtual circle, to connect, to learn, to thrive. And with that, I invite Michelle to step forward and to open the circle here today.
Thank you so much, Nurit. It's amazing to be with you. And we've had such nice conversations, Nurit and I, over the past couple of weeks and months. And so I've really been looking forward to this. So I'd like to tell you the story of my journey towards writing a book about the age of thrivability and seeing it coming to life and seeing that more than ever in the past year. And I wonder, I'll be curious to hear if you're seeing that trend as well. I've been on this journey and offering this invitation to people for about 20 years. And the past year has had tragedy and real challenge, and also has opened things up like I've never seen before. And it's easier and easier to have these conversations. More people are drawn to them. And I don't know if we were all just sort of hiding, thinking we were the only ones, and now it's our time or what, but it's really an exciting time. What got me started on this journey is noticing that we had a guiding story, a paradigm or a worldview that tells us everything in the universe operates like a machine, especially our organizations. There's this big story, this worldview and paradigm that I'm sure you've noticed as well. The dominant story of the past several hundred years, and in fact, the origins of it are in ancient Greece. But the way it has showed up in our lifetimes is as a very mechanistic story that tells us everything works like a machine, especially our organizations, in which the only purpose is productivity and profitability, and in which we are understood to be separate from each other, separate from the organization. We are cogs in the machine, human resources and human capital that are put into this machine that is the organization. And we're separate from nature. We exist to compete and consume. That's the whole story. And there is some truth to it. It's not all wrong. It's just not the whole story. And that incomplete story has shaped every aspect of our lives. It has shaped our educational systems, and Raiden, as you were saying, it has shaped our approach to healthcare, in which it's less about truly finding health and much more about fixing the body as machine and treating symptoms and sickness. And that just isn't really the way life works. As we'll see, it has shaped how we grow food. So we have this industrial agriculture system, and it's shaped how we structure work. And again, there are some useful things within that story, but it's also led to so many problems. And I believe that every major problem we face in society can be traced back to this guiding story. It's a mechanistic reductionist story. It's the same story that gives us patriarchy and white supremacy, and the belief that we can dominate nature, colonization. It's all that same story. So if we hope to address any of those problems, those large problems, or even the smaller ones, they are all symptoms of this larger story. So if we hope to address them, then we need to really go to the root, which is the paradigm. And fortunately, there is a bigger story that is rising to, to dominance. It's not quite there yet, but it's rising up in prominence at least. And that is a story that says there are mechanistic aspects to life, but the bigger story is that we are in integral parts of the living earth and of all the living systems that are made up within that larger body. I like this image. I want to make it clear how this story of aliveness and of the earth and us and everything in it as living systems, how it's distinct from other stories like sustainability. So in the three images in black on the left, we see really the progression of the mechanistic worldview. In the far left, this is the dominant conventional system that gives us a pattern of take, make, and waste. And as we started to see that was problematic, we introduced green approaches with things like recycling. And as we saw that even that wasn't enough, we started to aim for sustainability and circularity, in which the goal is to hold a steady state. But we've started to recognize that we've done so much damage that we actually need to restore our natural systems and societies. We need to regenerate them. It's not enough to hold a steady state. And more than that, some of us are acknowledging that what's truly needed is to support life's inherent ability to generate and even regenerate itself continuously over time, to heal itself. So this shift in worldview is a shift in strategy. These approaches on the left are still fundamentally rooted in the mechanistic story. They are engineering approaches, and they are necessary, but they're not enough. They're not all that's needed. It's only when we start to explore regeneration and alignment with life's ability to thrive that we really start to have a large enough scope to bring something new into being. And here's where I start to talk about this term, thrivability, that the purpose is to enable life to thrive, to align with life's ongoing ability to thrive at every level, for individuals, for organizations as dynamic living systems, for communities as dynamic living systems, and for the biosphere. So my definition of thrivability is the informed intention and practice of creating the fertile conditions for life to thrive, of enabling life to thrive. So first, informed, because if we're going to create the fertile conditions for life to thrive, we need to know what are those fertile conditions and what does that take? What does that require of us? We have to be informed. And then we have to set that as our explicit intention, because currently, generally in society and in our organizations, we set our sights on something far less than thriving. And as a result, we're getting something catastrophically less than life's ability to thrive. So unless we get really clear in every context that the goal of everything we do is to enable life to thrive continuously, then we'll continue to fall short. We have to make that our clear intention. And finally, it's important to recognize that it's an ongoing practice. This isn't a certification program or a marketing program. This is like a spiritual practice or a yoga practice or a martial arts practice. It's a continuous deepening in wisdom and compassion and the ability to sense what's needed and to respond with effective action. So it's an individual practice. It's also a collective practice of stewarding life, essentially. So if we start with getting informed, I would like to share today what I've found and discovered about these fertile conditions that are necessary for life to thrive. And there are many ways that you can be informed. There is science, and that's sort of the root of my set of theories and principles, Western science. There's also indigenous wisdom And there's poetry and movement. There are many ways to become tuned in to what life needs. But here's what I sort of draw on, and I hope it can be useful. I'm going to describe 4 fertile conditions that we find in all living systems, in our bodies, in rainforests, in organizations and communities and economies. These are the conditions that have to be cultivated continuously if any living system is to thrive. And it's sort of that much biology. It is intuitive, you will understand it, and there won't be a test. But so I'm going to hit you with all 4 all at once, and I'll describe them in a general sense, and then I'll give you some examples as well. So here they are all at once. And I think of them as life's universal design principles, because everything I've been describing might sound very philosophical and ungrounded and intangible. What's our guiding story and our worldview? But it comes down to something really practical. This is how life works. These are the design principles for anything that's alive to be more effective and to be more self-generating. So it's actually a pathway to more effectiveness and efficiency. So here are the 4 patterns and conditions that we have to cultivate. The first thing we need to know is that in any thriving living system, there are diverse parts, and they are connected and supported in patterns and structures of relationship in a way that enables the emergence of a new whole, a new level of life with new capabilities and characteristics that we don't find at the level of the parts. And that's the magic we're after, right? That the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and that new things become possible. And what enables that process, what powers the magic, is life. It's whatever it is that animates us and makes us alive. Anything that's alive is self-organizing, self-generating, self-integrating, integrating parts into wholeness, self-regenerating or self-healing, because it is alive, right? And we don't have to really understand what that self-integrating, self-generating, self-managing property is. We don't have to know where it comes from. We definitely don't have to agree, but we do have to acknowledge that it's life that does the work. Otherwise, we stay stuck in that old story in which we believe that we are drivers of the machine. And we miss the opportunity to see ourselves as stewards or gardeners of something precious and alive. And sometimes I tell the story. I was struggling to figure out, how do I explain to people what that 4th thing is, life? It's so intangible and amorphous, and philosophers have been trying to figure it out for thousands of years, right? And most of biology ignores it, actually, which may be why we have this crisis in our healthcare system. So I was sharing this with my husband one day, and he said, well, it's the difference between you and your car. And I said, well, yeah, there it is. My car has individual parts that are brought together in patterns of relationship with me and with each other and with the road, and together they form a thing that's now not just a collection of parts, but is a whole car, and it has the emergent capability to move me around town. But my car can never have a great idea or be my friend or adapt to completely unforeseen circumstances. It can't heal itself, and it can't generate a whole new car. But I can do all of those things, the human version of them, because there is life. And our organizations can do those things, our communities and our economies. So one of the ways we see, one of the ways we experience this set of conditions is in the basic inspired conversation. Every time we're in one of those really fantastic conversations, or if we want one of those, if we're hoping to have one of those, then we should create the conditions for each person to bring their unique perspectives, right? We want everybody's voice in, and the diversity of those voices. And we should create the conditions for respect and for taking turns and for for the same language. If we speak the same language, that'll make it a lot easier to have an inspired conversation. In human communities, what enables wholeness is shared purpose and shared identity. So if we want an inspired conversation, then we should think of a question that is really important, that will hold us together like a magnet, so that we're not just a crowd of separate individuals, but as we explore this really compelling and meaningful question together, then we start to become that whole that's greater than the sum of its parts, right? Our group starts to take on a life of its own. And if no one tries to choreograph and control too much, but we're allowed to follow our inspiration, the spirit of life, right, as it flows through us, and we follow the energy and our interest, then we will be elevated. I hope you all have had that experience where you surprise yourself with your genius, in really inspired your conversations, and you think, where did I come up with that? You're smarter and energized. You're in flow. The psychologists have written about flow. That's what we're after, right? That's a sign that you've cultivated the fertile conditions. And that's what we want in our projects and our organizations and our communities. We want to create the conditions for life to thrive, to be able to thrive. So in setting our intention to enable life to thrive, that becomes the core purpose of our work, especially in our projects and our organizations. There can be things that we are contributing into the world, but really the first and foundational purpose of our work is to be in this practice, to create a practice ground for a more thrivable world. And the more organizations that do that, the more projects, the more families, the more that becomes the dominant story and the dominant lived experience. And we connect them to each other, and it becomes the way that life works. Really good. There's a model that's called Berkana's 2 loops model. Maybe you've seen this, where the old is still useful, which may be why it's still hanging around. We do need the lights to stay on. And so there are people who are drawn to keep it going and act as hospice workers. And then there are those like us who are busy working to originate, to midwife the new. And then there are those who help create bridges. There are lots and lots of versions of this. You can look up 2 loops model. So I think that may be also kind of a source of my impatience. Come on, let's get on with it. But it's a hospicing the old and a giving birth to the new. So let me tell you about my work with farmers, because it's sort of connected with all of this. So a few years ago, I started working with Regeneration Canada, a nationwide nonprofit that's focused on the regenerative agriculture movement. So this is, in this case, what's being regenerated is the soil. And you might know that among all of the crises in the world, soil is right up there, that we have something like 50 or 60 growing seasons left. And then no more ability to grow food for us, because the soil is so depleted by the industrial agriculture system, the mechanistic system, in which farmers have been taught for the past maybe 60 or 70 years that they're the ones who grow the plants with their chemicals and their heavy equipment. And what we're rediscovering is that it's actually the living soil that grows the plants, and that the farmer is supporting those fertile conditions so that life can work its magic. So I started working with Regeneration Canada, and then got in touch with a group across Ontario. First a small group, and then I started working with the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario. And in this first group, it was a group of women. I think of them as the matriarchs that many communities have, who noticed there's something missing in the community. There's something else that seems to be needed. And so naturally they got together in the kitchen of one of these women to talk about it. Do you notice it too? And what should we do about it? And so what they were noticing is that there was nothing that brought all the different types of farmers together. So we've got cattle farmers and massive monoculture farmers and the little market gardeners. They've just got a couple of acres and other types. But they recognize that what could bring them all together is soil. All farmers care about soil. So they brought in an expert speaker, and they were right that this was something really compelling, and it brought everyone together. So as I started to engage with them, and I shared these 4 patterns and fertile conditions of living systems, it helped them understand better how soil works. And it also helped them understand how their community worked. That soil turns out to be this fabulous teacher for all contexts. And I had been talking about these patterns for a long time, but soil is somehow really interesting and really easy to understand. So I want to share how those patterns show up in soil and see if you can imagine what that might mean for your organization or for your community as well. What would it mean to cultivate the soil of community? So in soil, and there in healthy, thriving, living soil, there's this massive amount of diversity of microorganisms. So that's the first one. So lots and lots of insane amounts of diversity, that more than stars in the galaxy, in a handful of soil. So and those microorganisms secrete. They give out what one scientist calls snots, slimes, and glues. And those snot, slimes, and glues serve to aggregate the mineral dirt that's not alive. Dirt is not alive. It's really just minerals. But those microorganisms are moving through the dirt, and they secrete the snot, slimes, and glues, and it binds the dirt together to create passageways and structures that support and connect them. And if there is enough diversity and enough of a supportive and connective structure in the dirt, then there's this phenomenon that another scientist calls quorum sensing. And quorum in a human community is when we have enough people present. Maybe the rules say it has to be 51% or 2/3 of us, that we are allowed to make a decision and take action. So in soil, the microorganisms sense when they have quorum, when there's enough diversity and enough supportive connective structure, and they go through a phase change, a change in the nature of them, so that they're no longer just a bunch of microorganisms in dirt. Now they are a whole living system that is soil. And now they have the ability to hold water. That system has the ability to hold water, and that prevents droughts and floods. Now they have the ability to draw carbon out of the atmosphere. And so regenerating the soil is possibly the most powerful way to counteract climate change and global warming. And now they have the ability to grow plants. And all of that is, of course, self-organizing and self-integrating. And the farmer's role is really to support those fertile conditions. So the way that farmers are discovering that they can support this is not to have a monocrop, not to have all corn, all soybeans, because all those diverse microorganisms are fed by the crops, by the plants, and they all like to eat different things. So we need diversity of crops. And farmers are discovering that instead of leaving the soil bare in between the crops, the main crops, which leaves the soil exposed and unprotected, instead the farmers plant a low cover crop, a crop that covers the ground and helps to protect that structure that the microorganisms have created. And it might be a cash crop, or it might be just to protect and nourish the soil. Farmers are learning that they shouldn't till or plow the soil, which in industrial agriculture they do many times a season. So there's more to that, but not a whole lot more to regenerative approaches to agriculture. So with the farmers that I was working with, this explanation helped them understand why they were doing what they were doing. And to my surprise, this was new to them. It also helped them understand their learning community and how they could invite the diverse voices of each of the members of their learning community, and how they could make sure that their sharing of information and decision making and learning was flowing effectively. And the more that they understood kind of the bigger picture and intention behind their work, the more powerful was their alliance. In addition to working with farmers, I also work with the tourism sector in several countries. And there, I'm inviting them to shift from a story, I'm helping them shift from a story in which they're trying to grow the tourist destination, to manage a tourist destination and to get the conveyor belt. The model is really one of a conveyor belt to get as many people through as possible and kind of shake loose as much money from their pockets as we can as they go. So instead, we're exploring what happens when we see our work as cultivating the host community, most of all, and cultivating the soil of that host community. So I'm working with a national tourism organization and with 7 regional tourism organizations across New Zealand. The first one is Northern Ireland, the second one is New Zealand. And I've got colleagues in both, and in particular, a woman named Anna Pollock, who's quite a visionary in the tourism industry. But in the case of New Zealand, 150 people have signed up for a 10-week course. We're about halfway through right now. So there's interest and there's a hunger, even as different sectors, agriculture, tourism, healthcare, they're all running up against the limits of the mechanistic story, and not just the limits, but the damage. And we're seeing that part of what's needed is not only to see every individual organization as a practice ground, that's needed, but also as a sector, we need to come together and shift the conversation, because it takes so much courage. It takes so much courage, and there are structural shifts that are needed that really require the whole sector to set new intentions. So we're seeing that. And in fact, there was a really encouraging report that was just released in New Zealand by the government that outlined a vision for that industry rooted in Indigenous thinking. Then a new minister came in and said, no, we don't want to do that. But the good thing is the report had already been released. And so the industry is kind of saying, we don't need your permission anymore. It's out. We can't unsee that. So the conversation is continuing. So I want to share 2 things that I find helpful in moving forward into an age of thrivability. One is to pay attention to our language and the metaphors we use. And notice when we're using mechanistic language, it's everywhere. And once you start to tune into that, you see how prevalent it is. So in one example, you all might know the transition town movement that started out of England. It's community-based moves towards more life-aligned ways of being. And so my local transition town group asked for my help, and they said, well, we see ourselves as an umbrella organization for all of these different community projects. And I said, what would happen if you thought of yourselves not as an umbrella organization, but as fertile soil for community projects? What kinds of skills now come to mind, and what kinds of activities, and how much more evocative, meaningful is that for you? So that's the easy thing, I think. Just pay attention to your language and see what new inspiration comes up when you swap out the mechanistic for the organic. And the not as easy, but very powerful, is to have bigger conversations and ask bigger questions. So you can ask, for example, what more would it mean for each of us individually to be able to bring the best of ourselves, to feel deeply at home in this work, in this place, and in our own bodies? And what could support that? Can you imagine, in your next project, asking that as a foundational question? What more could it mean for our infrastructure and interactions to support not only information sharing, decision making, and effective action, but trust, playfulness, learning, and joy? And I'll send you all of these, by the way. You don't have to try to write all of it down. But what more could it mean for our patterns of belonging with colleagues, customers, and community to be infused with a sense of dedication, earnestness, flow, perhaps even sacredness? And what could support that? What are we called to express and create together in service of life? How can we be essential to this moment, uniquely capable of contributing some vital aspect of a more thrivable world? What is the wisdom that is needed now? And finally, what would bring the most life to this process and this project? How can we be inspired, nourished, renewed, and even surprised by nature, beauty, art, music, movement, and celebration? How can we allow life to flow through us so that we can truly savor this experience of being alive? These are the questions we need to be asking so that our projects and our organizations and our communities can truly be practice grounds for a more thrivable world. Maybe I'll offer one last thing, and then it feels like that's probably enough. We've really gotten a lot out of this conversation, it feels. So I mentioned the word stewardship along the way, that this the purpose is to create our projects, our organizations, our communities as practice grounds for stewarding life. And my definition of stewardship is that it's the combination of reverence and responsibility. And just listening here, I'm realizing how much reverence is in some ways the feminine, and responsibility is the masculine in the stereotype. That reverence comes from recognizing that anything that's alive is beyond our comprehension. We can't even fathom its full potential. It's beyond our control, really. And therefore it's worthy of our reverence. It's miraculous and magical by being alive. And even though we can't know and we can't control, we can't comprehend, we feel called to care and to respond, to be responsible to its needs, responsive to the needs of this living system in front of us. So there's this paradox of reverence and responsibility that brings the masculine and feminine together in stewardship. And it's a practice, because you don't know, there's no manual that says this is how much to be responsive and this is how much to just be reverent. But that's kind of life's purpose, to be in that practice and that dance.
Absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much, Michelle. It was such an honor to have you here, such a privilege. Thank you all so much for coming. Please join us again in our next Ecological Consciousness Exchange gathering that we'll be having soon. The next one will be with Ron. And thank you again, Michelle.